Please join me for Ask the Good Doctor, live today and every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 12 noon Central Standard Time, and 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Bring your questions.
Hello, good afternoon. It's Wellness Wednesday. I'm Dr. LaJoyce Brookshire, and welcome to Ask the Good Doctor. And here we help you attain, maintain, and reclaim your perfect health, mind, body, and spirit. And today we are going to tackle a subject that helps you come along with the human condition. We are going to enrich the human condition today. I've got a wonderful guest with us. She is the author of this amazing book. We'll talk more about it. Her name is Rhonda V. Magee, and she is a law professor at the University of San Francisco, as well as a mindfulness-based stress reduction expert. I love that, all about her, so you know why she's here. Mindfulness-based stress reduction. Woo, that's a mouthful, but she's going to tell us all about it. So Rhonda, I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brookshire, Dr. LaJoyce. It's really beautiful to be with you. Thank you so much.
Listen, I heard Rhonda on a radio show and I had to pull over my car. It touched me so deeply and I stalked her. Yes, I did. I stalked her until I found her and said, "Can you be on my show like today?" And I was late for an appointment because I sat in my car until I found her contact information. That's how powerful and impactful her message was. And it resonated with me deeply, and I know that it will with you too. I want to get right at it. Chris, if you could show us her book. It is The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness. Wow, that is so poignant. Yes.
Mhm.
Now, can you define for us what is actually the inner work of racial justice?
Well, the book really explores how these practices of mind body awareness, that we refer to when we use the phrase mindfulness, practices of compassion, awareness, and presencing, like being present to what's happening in our lives, in our bodies, interpersonally, what's happening between us with other people, being aware of our emotions, so emotional intelligence. So that whole complex of what we call mindfulness and compassion generating practices. My work has been about applying those to the hard work of exploring what racial justice really is like from the inside out. And when I say inside out, I've been a law professor for 20 plus years. I was a lawyer practicing before that. I was born in North Carolina, at a time when we were in the kind of post-civil rights era, but we were still had our, as we still do in many ways today, had our backs up against the wall, dealing with all the legacies of oppression. And so I had been exploring how mind body awareness practices, how mindfulness practices were supporting me in my journey from that little town in North Carolina to law school and graduate school, and then ultimately practicing law in this big city of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
So I had already had a personal practice. But what I had been able to start to see, what I was starting to see was that in my work as a law professor, teaching about racism in American legal history, gathering students together from different backgrounds, we were all learning from each other. Number one, some of the difficulties of turning toward these issues and
Yeah.
staying in the conversation for a while, and learn, and how we each have some different piece or of the story, especially when you come together from around the world, which we do in San Francisco,
Mm-hmm.
and how we were learning cognitively, but something was also happening to the bodies during the process, and it wasn't
Yeah.
always easy. And so
Yes.
we just started to draw on these practices to help deal with that emotional awakening and the strong emotions that were coming up sometimes, the sadness, the despair, the grief.
Yeah.
Deal with the challenges of the cognitive dissonance, right? I'm seeing this news for the first time. I'm learning this for the first time. The shame of like discovered ignorance around our history.
Mm.
So the different things along those lines, I started to realize, I know when I leave these classes, I'm going into practice, or before the class, I'm settling on some practices to help me navigate it. I need to be able to bring this to my students. So I
Yeah.
started bringing it into the classroom, and it's from, that was back in like 2004. And so where we are today is the result of more than a decade of experimentation and sharing and working to develop a way of bridging these modalities of mindfulness and compassion practice on the one hand, and then really exploring what racial justice might mean from the inside out. And by which I just mean, we got to start with ourselves.
That's it.
Have to start with ourselves. And that's where we come together in this conversation, right?
Absolutely. Because when you say that your work is about doing the work on the inner self and meeting the racism head on, my work is about naming the body part, or the what the body may be feeling internally, and how to overcome it. And so in this space, it's adrenal exhaustion. Our adrenals are on overload, and always are on high alert, just hyper vigilant consistently, and we cannot maintain it. It's not sustainable.
Mm-mm.
And so this book then I found to be a solid solution, a tool by which we can use to combat this exhaustion that we feel internally, yet cannot name.
Exactly. And we are just becoming more aware. I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I'm so glad that you're doing the work you're doing, just to inform us, to help bring, again, awaken us to, what we've been able to witness if we've been paying attention in our families, in our neighborhoods. We know everyone's exhausted. And we know there's a sense of like hypervigilance, hair trigger tempers. We are, in other words, bearing up right now in this period of multiple interlocking pandemics, right? With
Mhm.
public health and reckoning with racism and climate distress and all that. Right now, we're feeling the extra,
Absolutely.
right, the extra stress. But we're also, we're legatees. We have inherited,
Ah,
right, intergenerationally, right? All of this, kind of hyper vigilant adaptation to constant stress and vulnerability.
mhm.
And so for me, yes, learning a little bit more about stress reactivity in the body, which my own training as a teacher in mindfulness-based stress reduction helped me to learn. Because you don't learn this. I was a law professor. I got a graduate degree in sociology. No one really typically, right? If we're getting all these fancy degrees, trains
Wait,
us this
wait.
whole body
That's
work.
right. While enduring
Yeah,
exactly this,
exactly.
the more degrees you attain, the more mess you accumulate.
Exactly. Right?
Because there's no class on this.
There's no class on this. There's no class on this. And so, right. So really, I thank you so much for, again, creating this space, for inviting us all into just pausing. And first of all, because I often, like many mindfulness teachers, we start where we are.
Yeah.
And we recognize that we all have some insight, wisdom, subjective knowledge about what it is that we're talking about. If we pause, we know we've got experience with stress reactivity. Think of a time when we've really found ourselves being triggered by some comment, some microaggression, something we saw on the news. It can happen any day, any hour, right?
So you brought it up first. So I'm going to zip all the way down to the end of my script here. Well, I'm asking you about microaggressions. What exactly are some tools, Rhonda? I shouldn't call. I should call you Dr. Rhonda.
No, I'm a master's and a JD. I'm not a PhD, but you can call me professor or you can call me Rhonda. Either way, it's perfectly okay.
All right. The microaggressiveness, it is abound. And I think that we need some solid solutions to dealing with the microaggression and some language.
Yes.
So that when we see it, we can confront it.
Yes, yes, yes.
How do we do that without getting suspended, expelled, fired, written up, put on probation?
Right. Whew. Well, I mean, so I really appreciate the two different parts that are standing out to me in your question. One is, what are some tools for us to respond rather than react to some of these triggers? Okay. We do have them, and mindfulness can support us with them. And I will in a moment describe a bit of that. But the other part that you described is, how do we do that without getting written up, fired, et cetera? Now you're inviting us to open up the aperture on the contexts that we find ourselves in and the power dynamics that we are bearing up with, which are, again, part of what is that stressful container that we're in all the time.
Yes.
That we sometimes need to figure out how to step back and step out of, right? Okay. So what mindfulness can do is help us bear up with the difficulty that we cannot escape immediately, right? The serenity prayer, God grant me the power to accept the things I can't change the things I can, wisdom to know the difference. We have power to make change. We have power, first and foremost, to develop the capacity to respond rather than react to microaggressions. So just to speak a little bit more about that. When we are in the many different ways that we might, and this term microaggressions, by the way, was originally developed, as you or listeners may well know, but just to say, by a Black psychologist out of Harvard who was treating well-educated, people who were, middle class to even upper class Black folk who were coming into his office and describing how, just to say, this is a feature of our experience, whatever our economic background. We are not protected from microaggressions by virtue of somehow having a job or being wealthy. We know this. What this doctor was hearing in client and patient after client and patient were these stories of these very subtle, often unintentional, sometimes maybe intentional, right? Or at least negligent, posing a risk of offense, but like these subtle, very quick, often stunning and stinging remarks that indicate disregard, disrespect, or insult. Or even worse, sometimes, again, there's been an elaboration of microaggression to include micro assault, when we know something really is throwing what they know to be a wounding word your way. Now we're talking beyond what's called microaggression into micro assault, or you might call it almost a micro attack. And then there are what's, on the other hand, more subtle designations called micro invalidations, where we're just sort of not recognizing your reality or minimizing and invalidating your perspective and your experience. So the research since Dr. Pierce elaborated on this idea, back in the late 70s, I think it was, has helped us understand that microaggressions have a wide variety of manifestations and forms. They are not just racial, but they intersect and are. So you got the kind that we as Black women might get, maybe different from the kind that Black men might get, for example. And let me just say also, there are, ways that the thinking and the research around this is starting to apprehend that, as I noted a little bit before, the sort of painful incidents that we associate with microaggressions can show up in visual form, right? So the mascot right, sensitivity is one indication of that. If we
Yeah.
come into a place and we see some signage or some posters that seem disturbing or that disregard certain types of life, right? So in other words, we're starting to realize that this isn't just something that can happen verbally, although that's where it was first identified. It
Uh-huh.
can be visually, behaviorally. It's the person crossing the street or turning away when we appear, when everybody else seemed to be perfectly welcome.
Mm.
So subtle behavior or verbal or environmental indicators that disrespect who we are. And how do we respond to this?
Yeah.
Because it can happen anytime. I know from my own experience,
Oof.
right? Here you
Yes.
are at an office meeting or a workshop on campus or wherever it might be. And again, often I think people say things, there is that category that's unintended, just
Mm-hmm.
coming out of, let's just say we're coming from different walks of life and we don't understand how some comment might actually just be offensive to someone
That's
else.
right.
So I think part of it is pausing. So in my
Mhm.
book, I talk a lot about, first of all, it's important to become intentional about our agency and the power
Mhm.
that we have to reclaim the ability to be well, even in difficult circumstances,
Yeah.
by, for example, making a commitment to wellness practices, to meditating. And again, there are a wide range yoga, movement practices. For me, meditation is, and the research confirms that can be a really important foundational
So
practice,
much.
right? You can bring it into yoga,
Yep.
you can bring it into
I want to
anything.
pause. I want to talk about two
Yeah.
microaggressions that yank my chain. The first one is repeatedly asking, does that make sense? Does that make sense? That is a phrase which has seeped into the American lexicon that is microaggressive, and we don't even know it. And because it's just something that people are repeating consistently. So it's like the game of parakeet. People are just saying it and saying it. Oh, and I have had to advise my students that is a microaggression. Don't say it.
Mm.
Because I don't ever remember Black people asking me, does that make sense? I can't stand it. And the one time I literally flipped my wig on a woman on the phone in a business interaction I'm doing, and she's supposed to be like this regional manager for my region, and we're having this conversation, and she asked me, does that make sense, like one time too many? And I said, lady, I mean it it was so condescending
Yeah.
and and so overt that I could not ignore it, to the point where I got off that team. Because
Hmm.
if I had to face her one more time, it was probably going to be the showdown of the girl from the south side of Chicago who got suspended 14 times and expelled. And she didn't need to see all of that. I don't even need to see all of that. Okay,
Yeah.
that's long ago. The other one is when people start getting really comfortable with you, you start hearing them say things, especially about me as a light-skinned Black person.
Hmm.
Oh, she's got white in her family, I'm sure. Or even asking you, do you have white in your family? I can't stand that. I can't. The answer is yes, but do you want to know the reason why?
Yeah.
Because I,
Right. There's a lot in that question.
woo,
There
Rhonda,
is a lot in that question.
it's so loaded.
Right. I mean, implicit assumptions of value running through, and racist assumptions
Oh,
running
totally racist
through,
assumptions.
right?
Yes, we're back to the class. Racist.
Exactly. Right. So here we are, right? These are the kinds of things. And, you know, Doctor, you mentioned so clearly context matters,
Yes,
right?
it
You know,
does.
you're noting perhaps you're the only, a lot of us find ourselves in situations where we're the only of our identity category, right? We might be the only Black woman in the room. We might be the only, right, one in leadership or in management or something along those lines. And in those contexts where we're surrounded by, white bodied, white racialized folk, these slings and arrows, and they can come, very in ways that I will say, I'm sure, as you mentioned, the first one, take the first one. Is that clear, or does that make sense? Does that make sense? I do, as you were mentioning, we sort of have gotten a little bit trained in professional cultural settings to say that, but in context, it can be particularly troubling, right? It's one thing for me to say that in front of a class of law students where I know I'm delivering something, that the concept that they haven't heard before,
that they've never heard before.
You need to pause and make sure they get it.
That's different.
Right. But when it is just, we're all speaking English now. We're all educated people. You're right. And when there is that racial difference, again, context and power differentials, not necessarily role power, but identity-based status, differentials, race-based differences in the room. This can make, again, for what somebody might think is an innocuous statement, they use it all the time.
Yes.
So our challenge is, again, to support us in discerning what's the wise response right here, right now. And if right here, right now, we need to get off, pause, take a break, get out of this conversation. Like you described, we didn't necessarily need to bring out the girl from the South Side, right? But we knew we could, and we knew we had options. And mindfulness is there to help support us. We all know this, but it's really there to give us practice, on that cushion or the meditation space, noticing the remembering that thing that's getting our blood boiled, and noticing how the emotional reactivity that we can feel in the body, the heart racing, the throat getting warm, the face getting hot, whatever it is, the hands moving a little bit. We can bring those experiences back in a controlled way on the cushion. And then also notice, if we just keep breathing through, feel that ground beneath us, feel the support of a good, conscious and deep and cleansing breath, feel the ancestors who know that, we're here to do more than just rumble with this person and support us, right? And so we can practice without being in the setting with another person, but really allowing our mindfulness practice to give us, experience working with the impermanence of these feelings. Because we all know the rage that we feel, the reactivity we feel, these are like waves of energy. They're not going to stay unless we churn them. And right, we can latch onto them, churn them. But if we can also witness, put ourselves in a place of witness. Oh, I see myself working myself up, working my adrenals, working all the stress. Is this good for me? I see who this person is. I see what I might need to do, but I do not need to take my body.
I don't need to participate.
Right. So being able to choose how to respond is the key, I would say, skillful support that mindfulness can give us in working with microaggressions. And then again, as you mentioned, at some point, the choice might be, I'm going to choose not to be in this particular interaction space, on this team, in this even job, if it comes to that.
Yes. Well, in this season of oppression and depraved behavior and negative speech, it seems overwhelming to consider even that our communities can be transformed through this.
Yeah.
And when bringing about the topic of mindfulness, I know for sure that in the Black and Brown communities, that they feel it's some esoteric, intangible,
something that white people do.
Something that white people do. Reserved for people who backpack through Tibet and someplace like that.
Exactly.
And it's not, but I just love how in your book you bring meditation and mindfulness to a place where it's attainable for anyone, especially in movement.
Yes, absolutely. Because, again, I love that you named the way that mindfulness is presented to us in the U.S. It's coming at us through the white-bodied experience most often. Even though, of course, these practices originate in communities in cultures of depth and beauty that are, of color. Whether we're talking about Asian heritage cultures or Native indigenous cultures or even African indigenous cultures or Latinx, the roots, our ancestral roots, grounded in the experiences and life ways and cultural sensibilities of a wide variety of people of color are kind of at the root of what we call mindfulness.
Okay.
They're at the root of what we also call today, for example, some of our self-help gurus, Brene Brown, I love her work,
Love her work.
Power of Vulnerability. You look at her research, disproportionately, she's researched the experiences of dealing with vulnerability and becoming wholehearted of women of color.
Mm.
Her
Yeah.
research,
True.
right? Respondents are disproportionately women of color.
Right.
So I'm saying all this to say a lot of these practices originate and have been time tested and, kind of circumstance tested in the lives of people of color who've been bearing up with stuff for generations and generations and generations in this worldwide, these worldwide systems of oppression that we're bearing up with, white supremacy and other. And yet when they come and get presented in the US, they're presented through that lens of that middle class, upper middle class, white male who is oriented toward sitting quietly,
Mm-hmm.
breath, scholarly research and application, very kind of uncomfortable with movement, uncomfortable
Yes.
with motion. So we've had to elaborate it out. And so, yeah, a mindful movement of all sorts, really, really beautiful. If we're uncomfortable sitting, as many of us are during these periods, or if we're physically not capable of sitting in that traditional meditation way, which many of us are not physically capable.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let that get in the way of you really seeing that what these practices are doing is inviting you, however you are in your body, to become more comfortable, more at home with it. If we need to rock, if we need to hold ourselves to remind ourselves that we're safe right here, if we pause and just feel that ground, that energy of the earth supporting us. However we need to do that, that's mindfulness. Singing, dancing. I was offering us a session at a healing retreat for people of color this past weekend, which, by the way, is something I can leave a resource with you. This is something that's offered like once a month, I think it is. And I was offering the final session on this one. At the end, somebody put on a Beyonce song and we're all dancing, and someone put in the chat, hey, we could have been doing dance meditation this whole time. Look at Rhonda, yes, we do a dance meditation now. So yeah, I mean, all of these things, the body needs to heal.
Yes.
Tapping, right?
Oh, yes,
there's a whole class of energy tapping, right? That we know really, really profound.
Really works.
Can seem kind of woo-woo, but it works.
Listen, to try to get my patients even to understand, no, it's not witchcraft.
Right.
It's not. And the tapping, oh my gosh, I'll never forget one time a husband of one of the patients, he came in on the session and I had the woman tap and I said, now what's your pain level? And she said, I don't feel anything. He jumped up and screamed, what just happened here? What just? And I thought, oh my gosh, he's going to never let her come back. And he didn't, but she left feeling better. However, in terms of movement, my form of mindfulness in terms of the earth and feeling it under your feet is walking. Yes. I live on a mountain, wooded area, and I don't let much disturb that time that I have with myself, my dog, and God. Yeah. And it's my appointment with myself. And I remember one time specifically that time was disturbed. It was mid-pandemic, and ambulance sped by me and went where I could see through the trees, and the first responder in me said no. And then when I heard people outside wailing, Rhonda, I mean that gut-wrenching, somebody died cry.
Yeah.
It took everything I had not to run in the direction of danger, to run toward danger, and to go the other way. And by the time I got back home, my dog looked up at me and said, we going home now? And then by the time I got in the house, I was just shaking because number one, my first inclination is to help. But I had to be mindful that I didn't have the capacity.
Yes.
And it's not good to give out of your capacity. And I needed to let my cup be refilled so that it could overflow. And I needed to finish the walk.
Yes.
but I was like this
Mm.
afterward.
Mhm.
And so I
Because you
was,
were disrupting a habit, or working with that habit energy of I go toward the danger and I'm a helper.
that's it. And I couldn't.
You
And I
couldn't do it.
couldn't.
Mm.
And I had to work with myself and be
Yeah.
mindful
Mhm.
that it was okay to choose me.
Yes. And indeed, it sounds like in that moment,
Yes,
really, really, really essential to choose you
yes,
so that you could restore and be able to be, right? How the resource, the helper, the person who goes into the fire
right.
with that strength, right? So we do need mindfulness to help us know when we need to step back,
That's it.
because the burnout and these high degrees of stress causing all kinds of health and well-being decrements. We're all suffering,
Yeah.
everything from lower life expectancies, greater
Mm.
lethality of the coronavirus, and high birth rate problems for Black women, or I'm sorry, birth and
Defects. Hmm.
defects and problems with delivering babies that
Yeah.
are healthy and living and thriving. I mean, we've got, in other words, a lot of different indicators
Hmm.
that we do need to take care of ourselves, and
Yes.
we also need better circumstances in the world. No, that's no doubt.
Yeah.
But the question is, how can we support ourselves as we are demanding more effective health care, safer conditions for our children in schools and neighborhoods, as
Mhm.
we are calling for a workplace that is microaggression free? How do we take care of ourselves? And I love your story, because that's a perfect example. That mindfulness for me can help me recognize when I do need a break, because
Mhm.
that burnout, of course, is when the body is trying to tell you need a break and we're pressing past it. That's one way that we can end up in burnout. It's also one way we can end up in worse states of illness and distress,
Oh,
even
absolutely.
unto death, when the body is telling you need to change and we're pushing past it. Mindfulness is a kind of a gentle, friendly support that starts in here and says, you know what? We rest when we need to rest. And we know when we need to rest, and we have developed that self-respect and care that says, we are going to take this rest. We're going to pause.
Mm. Hmm. And we're going to pause. We're going to come back in just a moment to continue this conversation. It's Rhonda V. And today we are doing Kitchen Warriors. At Kitchen Warriors, I actually prepare a meal, teach everyone how to make it, and then we sit down and eat it together.
You're tuned in to Ask the Good Doctor, live each and every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central, and 10 a.m. Pacific. Dr. LaJoyce Brookshire is here to answer your questions live.
Welcome back. I'm Dr. LaJoyce Brookshire, joined by Rhonda V. Magee, the author of The Inner Work of Racial Justice. We are having a delightful conversation. I hope you grabbed your good doctor notebook before you jumped on here today. And thank God for YouTube, because you can always, go back, rewind this videotape, because this is one that will help you with some solid solutions on how to overcome, till we can learn how to heal ourselves and transform our communities as well. Transformation, that is a huge word. It is my
Mhm.
favorite word. And
Mm.
when I came through chaplain school,
Mhm.
transformative learning was what they teach you in chaplain school.
Mhm.
And so the transformative part I was drawn to. And
Yes.
I guess it was I heard you speak on the radio before I
Mhm.
stalked you. When I heard you speak on the radio, it was transformative. So I'm
Mhm.
sensitive to those words,
Mhm.
because that is a part of my training. So it's in me.
Yes.
And That's why one of the reasons why I had to reach out. And so you were just talking about the body telling us not to push past the breaking point. But why do we do it, Rhonda?
Whew, that's a really important question, right? For all of us, because I think for each of us, it may be a little different, and that's one of the insights of mindfulness, is to say, I deserve to know my own habits, patterns, conditionings that are maybe a little different from the doctors, or maybe a little different from the professors, right? What are mine? For me, one of the things that I noticed when I started to really pay attention to how I might not be being my own best friend in times of distress. This was about 20 or 30 years ago, when I was just starting out my career, graduating from school. And I really started to pay attention to what would happen when I would be feeling sick or not well or a little tired. A voice inside my head would come down really hard on me. Like, I would have to deal with this inner push. Now, I understand a bit of where that came from, but I had to first recognize that voice was coming up on a regular whenever I actually needed some support for taking a break. And I was really about to be overwhelmed. The voice would be like, harsh language. I can't even repeat some of these things.
Yeah.
Where did this come from? I grew up in a household where, everyone was poor and working class. We were working hard to make ends meet. Nobody had time for being sick. Nobody had time for sick children missing school. So certainly I internalized some of that. Where my parents, they had internalized some of it. They grew up under similar circumstances, and you can see the lineage going back of people like us having a lot of messaging to deny our own needs for self-care on pain of our being able to stay alive, frankly. Some people... Negative messages saying, get up, keep moving. You don't know tired. Let me show just all these internalized messages. And so for me, I knew that was part of my own pattern. And who else could disrupt that but me?
That's right.
I couldn't. Nobody, no justice measure, no law. This was something I needed to do, to stop that and allow myself, if I needed a break, an evening off, a rest, a vacation, even to name that and claim that.
Yes.
And so mindfulness helped me, it helped me to say, oh, wow, I'm just feeling a little bit under the weather. And boom, here comes this voice of, you can't take a break. You got so much to do, blah, blah, blah. It's like,
not now.
Yeah.
Well, even to your point of why this interview was delayed, because of me, because this is what I've learned. Let me lead up to that. I've learned to stay in a posture of maintaining my wellness. I've learned to stay in a position where I'm ready, if I need to, run into the fire and head toward danger, because as a first responder, I never know when I am needed. Hence, I was just the day before we were supposed to do this, enjoying peace, quiet, solitude, and doing absolutely nothing. And I told my husband that. And then I got the phone call from my mother in distress, who tried to make it not really sound like distress. But because of just what you're talking about, nobody has time for that. LaJoyce is busy. She's doing this. She's doing that. She can't run here every time. I was looking at 1-800 Southwest right when she was talking. She was there. You understand? And when I showed up at that door the next day, she was beside herself, because I came to see. Now, in these times specifically, not being mindful of taking care of yourself means sometimes that you may not be able to take care of someone you love. Because if I am not mindful about making sure that I am overflowing with alkalinity and overflowing with my supplementation and overflowing with my rest and good meals and my gangster water.
Exactly.
Okay. that I am not overflowing. That's right. I am going to be hesitant, say like, oh, if I get on a plane right now, it might not be good for me. Oh, if I make this trip to Chicago, I might get sick. I don't have to worry about that. I want to encourage people to maintain a place so that you can be of service to someone else.
Oh, that's beautiful. And the way you just described that, the someone else, this is your mother, right? That discernment of when we need to say yes and how we need to structure our lives. I love that you're naming that very intentionality about putting yourself in a place consistently to have the foundation for being a resource when you need to be there. We only have one mother.
That's right.
And we're going through difficult times, right?
Yep.
So I love that story of saying, oh yeah, no, I hear this in her voice. I'm hearing this message. I'm needed there and I can do it.
And even though they are habitual with signaling the very thing you named, that is what has been passed down to us. You're right. Yeah. We have to be intentional about breaking that cycle.
Oh, so true. And that's transformational.
Yes.
Coming back to that, right? That's when we start to not just see that this is something that we can now talk about. We've got the language for it. We're all on arcs of learning.
Yes.
And as we learn, we get information. But then when we start saying, and this means I'm going to do this differently, we are, first of all, recognizing the way that our lives actually do matter inherently, right? The importance of this life. Like we don't know how long we have. We know that right now we have this opportunity to make the most of it.
Yeah.
And once coming from that place of like recognizing our inherent worth and value, then we start to tell ourselves a new story about how we need to spend our time.
Right.
I heard in you, Dr. Berkshire, was just, this is a new story. Like my story includes, this is how I take care of myself on the regular so that I have the resources. And that is a story. Many people are not raised with that. I know I did not see that modeled. So healing requires a sense of let's just say, let me put this out there as something that I think healing and systemic transformation require.
Okay.
One, that sense of wholeness that we were just talking about, the sense that I matter, my life matters. I'm interconnected with a world that has some resources for me, but that I also need to manage. Like I need to be in some sort of conscious relationship with how I want to live.
Yeah.
That is a kind of a wholeness claim, an integrity claim, a kind of a waking up to the value of our life. And then secondly, telling ourselves a new kind of story. Right? We all have different stories that we need. What is the new story that you need? What's the new story that I need to take me to the next level? What's the new story our community needs?
Yes.
Both the local community and the larger communities. The world is really reaching out for these new stories. And I say that because human beings are very narrative driven.
Yes.
We are running some story all the time.
All the time. What's your story?
Exactly. So if you get conscious about, all right, my story is, and fill it in, I am here to, as Alice Walker said, not miss the color purple in this life.
That's right.
No matter how difficult things are and what I'm bearing up against, there is beauty here. I'm not meant to suffer every moment of my life. I'm meant to feel joy. That's a new story. That's like, oh, okay, well, what's the joy that I'm missing right now that I can kind of shift into access and kind of open up to? And so tapping into wholeness and integrity, 1, 2, telling ourselves a new story, and 3 is, I think, related to those two. Really accessing purpose and meaning in a way that some of us call spiritual, but like realizing our lives are beyond this day-to-day drudgery, the larger arc of our career and our resume, all important, but we come from mystery. We're going to return to it.
Yeah.
And we come from an ancestral lineage that we are the dreams of these ancestors who have made it here. Yes. So that extra piece of like, my life actually is a lot more, is about a lot more than this. As important as this all is,
Yes.
I don't want to miss that piece too.
Right.
So those three things, when we realize all of those, and we embed in our daily practices and the new story that we're creating, an appreciation of our wholeness, our ability to self-author, right? That's what telling a new story
Yes.
is. Who am I? Let me tell you who I am. I'm the survivor of, right? I'm Nanny's
Right.
grandmother, right? And then seeing always that there's so much more, so we can access compassion for other people who are suffering. We can access a kind of a call to wellness that includes us, but is not only for us, and that is part of the legacy we want to leave for our children, right? And our children's children.
Well, I love that quote from Alice Walker. And I also love all of the quotes that you have at the beginning of every chapter. You have everybody from James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, to Ta-Nehisi Coates. I love Ta-Nehisi Coates. And even yourself. And when it comes to doing that inner work, how can we who are confronted with race, when race being everywhere, like James Baldwin, who quoted, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." Exactly. And I stated simply as, we cannot conquer what we don't confront. And so my favorite chapter is the one on personal justice, the art of practicing self-compassion. Because we are not taught enough that how you enter and exit a room matters. And you explore this very concept of entering a room full of elephants, you call it.
Yeah, people and elephants, right?
Because the elephant. And even you explore leaving a community. Now that's when I threw the book down. I was like, yes, she's my sister. Yes.
Because it's when we're basically, that title is like, we're going to come in and we're going to speak some truths. We're going to uncover some of the hidden, right? We're going to make the making the invisible more visible.
Yes.
So that we can confront and overcome. We need to be able to name. This is, so we're all standing on so many different shoulders, and we're all being inspired by some of these teachers. And this is why I use the quotes in my book. And I'm thinking of James Baldwin, who was just such a fierce truth teller. But what I've learned recently about our teacher, James Baldwin, was how much he struggled and how much he suffered underneath that with depression. And I understand, I can only imagine, because again, being that person who's confronting when the world is not listening well, and you have to confront it again and again and again, and not be met with the love that you're trying to give. Again, underneath all that he did, Martin Luther King did, Audre Lorde, even Colin Kaepernick, it's love. Like we just love ourselves and each other enough. We know we all deserve better, right?
That's right.
And then to not feel that coming back, I've recently learned how much pain that caused in James Baldwin's life. So confronting these realities, naming what people don't want to name, and coming back to those hard realities, right? It's not easy, but it can be done. And when we do it, we can feel a little bit more like, first of all, there can be this sense of fragility in the room, like we can't handle this. But once people start speaking the truth, everybody's temperature kind of comes back. I mean, we might have some moments, but we at least know we're having a real conversation.
At the very least.
And then trust can be built from that.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing we are suffering from, a massive and well-warranted distrust feels, right? So we don't trust each other. We don't even trust. And this is where we have to bring it home to our own community too. We've been wounded within the community so much that we've got, a lot of defenses to letting our guard down and being more vulnerable about the pain we actually feel and the difficulty we feel and the joy that we feel, all of it. The whole thing, we're much more guarded. And so this work is about helping create spaces where it can be safe enough that we can care. We can show the care that is in our hearts.
Yes.
And we can build up resilience so that we can tackle the hard stuff and get back to the love that is we're here to represent.
That's what we're here to do. And, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, and with a whole lot of people screaming that all lives matter, because they do, but I stand with you in the notion that being colorblind has its consequences.
Ugh, yeah.
And the protests during lockdown, as a result of the death of George Floyd, was our response to being pushed to the deep end of the pool.
Yes.
And
again
and again, shall we name them?
Mm-hmm.
And this, when we found out that we could protest and not drown, that all we had to do was stand up or tread water, that was so profound for me to be able to sit there and watch that. Please help us through that moment of people who refuse to see color and who wish to remain colorblind, even within our own race, and the dangers thereof.
Right. Researchers have shown us, social psychologists, neurobiologists, cognitive scientists, we all see race because we are, we're formed to survive and thrive and to perceive risks and to respond to them. And racism, if nothing else, has embedded a world where there are risks that come from, transgression, the rules around who belongs where and whose value, whose voice we should pay attention to. So we all know these rules. We're trying to disrupt them. We're trying to rewrite them, but we know something about them, and we know they're tied to melanin and hair type and, all of these markers that have been, again, associated with different racial categories for the maintenance of these systems of oppression. First enslavement, then segregation, Black codes, peonage, even today, mass incarceration and differential education, and on and on and on and on and on. The history of racism is something that's lived in our experience. And so, we can want to move past race. Who doesn't want to move past this, all of the parts of it that are limiting our potential?
Yes.
Right? Limiting our ability to feel the joy that comes with our existence. We, of course, want to move past it, but trying to do what your brain doesn't actually do is a recipe for a kind of psychosis.
Oh,
right.
You said a mouthful on Wednesday afternoon. Tell us all about it, Ms. Rhonda.
We cannot be at war with reality, but which is what we're trying to do. Like, we don't see race. We're beyond race. Your brain has already calculated 9 ways to, I don't know what, who done the landscape and the read of the room. We know the racialized bodies. I don't see race. It's a recipe for a kind of craziness. And really racism is, I'm just going to say, I've always been wondering, where are the psychiatrists to really help us understand the way that this is a psychological problem that we're working with. It is a normalized psychological problem.
That's it.
Right?
That's it.
These differential values. But we've internalized it, some of us, all of us, in some degree or another. And we might be working with it. We might have gotten ourselves out of it. But it's in the air all the time. And so to act as if, or to, I get it. I really do understand how we can be coming at that impulse from a place of, some well-meaning, and the intent can be good. But we've got to have the courage to say, this is my intent. I, of course, see race. It's like one of my psychology friends were saying, is a Black man who said, I've often wondered why people are so able to say, I don't see race. You never hear anybody saying, I don't see gender.
Yeah.
No, we see, because our whole lives are structured around finding that. So similarly, our lives are structured around being aware of the social implications of race. And yet we would never go around and say, I don't see gender. It's like, of course you see gender, we see race, we see all these things because, so yes, disrupting creating spaces where we can just be more real and be more real in relationship to our experience around these things is essential, because there's so many harms that can come from not speaking the truth about what our bodies know. Our bodies know, we know in our bones that race matters. We have been
Yes.
trained in so many different ways. So to be going through the world trying to deny that is, again, a recipe for unwellness.
That's right. And so ultimately then we need to be intentional
Yes.
about the work of healing ourselves, because ultimately it's our responsibility.
Exactly. And color insight, as opposed to color blindness, which I write about, is this invitation to kind of notice it's not always about racism, and race isn't always in the air, but sometimes it is. And having that ability to say, I'm noticing something just happened here. That statement seemed to reflect some assumptions about who our audience might be or who I am, right? I mean, in other words, we could be having a good day, eating ice cream together or walking along, and race isn't necessarily in the room or in the experience, although we can ask ourselves, it might subtly be, depending on where we're walking or what we're eating, right? So there's subtlety. What mindfulness invites is, we know how rich and subtle and nuanced life is.
Yes.
But we don't have the language often for it. And so it's really opening up and saying, look, we want to become more courageous about turning toward and owning our ability to name and describe and claim all the different ways that this thing called race and racism might be showing up in my life, might be similar to yours or different. How do we just, get more comfortable just saying, you know what? I'm feeling like part of what's happening here is, about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And having the courage to do that, having the courage to listen, not shut it down, right? And learn from each other as we listen. Observe when we hear something, we're getting reactive. Just notice it without being reactive. Keep listening.
Yes.
And then be courageous and move into a little bit of vulnerability around it. Like, I'm learning this for the first time. I hadn't noticed that. Being willing to say that I'm learning from you. Because I think insight realizes that our experiences are all different, and we do need to have conversations where we can listen to each other. Yeah. And then being able to, from that place, take some action. I've described what I talk about in the book, just in those words. I talk about this in the book, this color insight term, but I've also kind of dropped a little acronym that I've been using recently, the LOVE acronym. Listen, observe what's coming up, venture with vulnerability, take a little bit of a risk. Oh, I'm learning. This is uncomfortable for me. I want to hear more. I apologize, right? We got to be willing to take some risk to build trust, and then keep engagement. That's the E. So LOVE is a short acronym to give us a little bit of support for this kind of practice.
I love that, because love at the end of the day is all we need, and it will see us through it all. Professor Rhonda V. Magee, you are a treasure to this world. Thank you so much for this body of work. Run out and pick it up. The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves so that we can transform a community and ultimately the world. Yes. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for this body of work. It has
Thank
been
you. And for all that you're doing to shine a light on wellness and ways we can strengthen ourselves and our communities. Thank you. You're such an incredible blessing.
Oh, Dr. Thank you so much. Thank you for being. We'll see you again.
All right. Wonderful.
Okay. Bye-bye. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And that's all the time we have. Time's up. I want to thank my team, Christopher Green, who is our technical guru, IW supervising